There is a mummy in a museum basement that does not match the country it was buried in. For over a century, the story of ancient Egypt was treated as settled, a civilization frozen in gold and stone, its bloodline assumed to run in an unbroken line from the first pharaoh to the last, and from the last pharaoh into the families living along the Nile today. Names, faces, and fragments of old lineage were slotted neatly into that story. It felt complete. It felt permanent. Then scientists finally got permission to open the DNA. What they found did not simply confirm 4,000 years of assumption. It complicated it, layer by layer, until the picture of who the ancient Egyptians actually were, and how their ancestry connects, or does not connect, to the names and families of today, became something far stranger and far more human than the textbook version ever allowed. This is the story of what genetics revealed when researchers finally compared the DNA of mummified pharaohs, priests, and laborers against the genomes of modern populations across Egypt, the Levant, and sub-Saharan Africa, and what that meant for old family names still spoken along the Nile, names some believed carried a whisper of dynastic blood. For generations, the accepted story was built almost entirely from monuments, not molecules. Egyptologists reconstructed royal lineages from king lists carved into temple walls, from mummy wrappings, from tomb inscriptions naming fathers and sons going back generation after generation. It was an extraordinary record, one of the most detailed dynastic archives in the ancient world. And from it, a simple assumption took hold, that Egyptian identity, from the pharaohs to modern families bearing old regional names, represented a long, continuous thread, largely undisturbed by outside populations. It was a reasonable assumption. Egypt was geographically distinct, culturally self-contained for long stretches, and proud of a written history stretching back further than almost anywhere else on Earth. But even before DNA entered the conversation, there were cracks historians could never fully explain. Ancient Egyptian art itself showed strikingly different skin tones and facial features across different dynasties and regions, some scenes depicting rulers and officials with clearly northern, Levantine-associated features, others showing deep connections to Nubian and sub-Saharan African populations to the south. Trade records described constant contact with Canaan, Nubia, Libya, and later Greece and Rome. Foreign-born queens, foreign-born officials, entire foreign dynasties, including Nubian pharaohs who ruled Egypt directly, appeared throughout the record. The story of a single, isolated bloodline never quite fit the evidence sitting in plain sight. Something was off, long before anyone sequenced a genome. The real turning point came when researchers were finally able to extract usable ancient DNA from mummified remains, something long considered nearly impossible, because Egypt's heat and the chemicals used in mummification tend to destroy genetic material. A breakthrough study, published in Nature Communications, successfully sequenced DNA from dozens of mummies spanning roughly 1,300 years of ancient Egyptian history, from individuals buried at Abu Sur el-Melek along the Nile. This gave scientists 3 tools they had never had at this scale before. Mitochondrial DNA, tracing maternal lineage. Y chromosome data where preservation allowed, tracing paternal lineage. And autosomal DNA, offering a broader genome-wide comparison against ancient and modern populations across Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean. The old map, built from inscriptions and assumption, was finally being tested against a deeper archive. The genome does not care what a king list says. It only records what actually happened, generation after generation, in the bodies of the people who lived it. If stories like this fascinate you, where the evidence quietly forces a rewrite of the accepted history, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the ancient past than most documentaries admit. What the DNA revealed did not simply confirm either side of the old debate. The ancient Egyptian mummies analyzed in that study showed genetic ancestry most closely related to ancient populations of the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly Anatolia and the Levant, with a smaller genetic contribution from sub-Saharan Africa during that particular time period and location, in that particular sample. That finding alone surprised many, because it complicated a simplified assumption on one side of a long-running debate. But that was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a second one. Because when researchers compared those ancient genomes to modern Egyptian populations, they found something almost the reverse of what many expected. Modern Egyptians, on average, carry noticeably more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies sampled from that site and that era. The genetic shift, researchers suggest, likely reflects increased mobility, trade, and population movement along the Nile in the centuries after the mummies were buried, particularly during the era of trans-Saharan trade networks and later migrations, well after the age of the pharaohs shown in that specific sample had ended. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. It suggested that ancient Egypt was never one static population, frozen at a single genetic snapshot. It was a corridor, a narrow, fertile thread of land connecting Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean world, absorbing people, trade, war, and marriage from every direction for thousands of years, both before and after the era most documentaries choose to focus on. Researchers have proposed a few explanations for the layered picture that emerged, and it's worth sitting with more than one, because no single theory fully accounts for everything the data shows. The first is regional and temporal variation. Ancient Egypt spanned 3,000 years and a long, narrow strip of geography, meaning ancestry likely varied significantly by era, by region, and by social class, long before any single, typical Egyptian genome could be said to exist. The second is post-pharaonic admixture, later historical migrations, trade expansions, and population movements along the Nile corridor and across the Sahara, occurring well after the specific mummies in that landmark study were alive, gradually shifting the ancestry profile of the region's population over the following centuries. The third, more difficult to fully resolve, is sampling limitation. The mummies successfully sequenced so far come from one site, one region, and a specific window of time, meaning they may not represent the full genetic diversity of ancient Egypt as a whole, particularly in the south, near Nubia, where DNA preservation has proven far more difficult. Scientists remain genuinely cautious here. This is not a settled picture. It is an opening one. Which brings us to the names. Long before written records, Egypt did not use family surnames the way we understand them today. Identity was tied to titles, professions, and place. But over the following millennia, as Arabic naming traditions layered onto the region following the 7th century Islamic conquest, many family names that endure in Egypt today became tied to specific ancestral villages, tribal lineages, and regional identities along the Nile, some in areas continuously inhabited since pharaonic times, including communities near Luxor, Aswan, and the Nile Delta with documented multi-century residency in the same locations. This is where the twist becomes personal rather than purely historical. Genetic genealogists working with modern Egyptian participants have found that individuals from certain long-settled Nile Valley families, particularly in Upper Egypt, closer to Nubia, carry Y chromosome and mitochondrial lineages that trace back with notable continuity to populations that lived in that same region for thousands of years, based on comparison with the limited ancient DNA data available. Not proof of a direct line to a specific named pharaoh, the evidence does not support that level of individual certainty, and no credible study claims otherwise. But something more grounded, and in some ways more remarkable, deep regional continuity, in specific families, in specific villages, stretching back further than most historical records can even document. Not a fantasy of royal blood. A quieter, better supported story of belonging to a place that has been continuously inhabited since the age the pyramids were built. The surprise was not that some families are distantly connected to ancient Nile Valley populations. The surprise was how the ancestry actually breaks down once tested, sometimes aligning closely with the ancient mummified samples, sometimes reflecting the later African admixture that reshaped the region long after the pharaohs, and sometimes carrying signals from Levantine and Anatolian populations that arrived by trade, conquest, or migration in eras far removed from anything Hollywood ever put on screen. This matters beyond Egypt. It matters because it forces a reconsideration of how identity has always worked, everywhere. There is no such thing as a genetically pure ancient civilization, because civilizations are not sealed containers, they are crossroads. Population history is not a straight line drawn backward from a modern name to an ancient king. It is a delta, a network of channels, absorbing and redistributing people across thousands of years, until a single modern genome carries the fingerprints of a dozen ancient migrations at once. Picture the Nile at dawn, somewhere south of Luxor. Mist lifting slowly off water the color of hammered iron. Palm trees leaning toward the current. The felucca sail catching the first orange light, exactly as it would have 3,000 years ago. Somewhere nearby, in a village that has occupied this same strip of riverbank for longer than most nations have existed, a family wakes up carrying, without knowing it, fragments of ancient Nile Valley ancestry, fragments of Nubian ancestry, fragments of Near Eastern ancestry, woven together so completely over centuries that no single label could ever fully describe them. That is the part the old story missed. It wanted a straight line from Tutankhamun to a name in a modern registry. The genome offers something more honest instead, a record of continuity and change happening simultaneously in the same bloodline, across the same stretch of river, for 4,000 years. If your family name traces to the Nile Valley, the DNA is not telling you that your connection to ancient Egypt is imaginary. It is telling you something more interesting than a fairy tale about a single pharaoh. It is telling you that you may be carrying an authentic thread of continuity from one of the longest continuously inhabited regions on Earth, not because of one dramatic ancestor, but because your ancestors simply stayed, generation after generation, while empires rose and fell around them. The mystery is not resolved. New ancient genomes are still being recovered from sites researchers have barely begun to sample, particularly further south, where the Nubian kingdoms once rivaled Egypt itself for power over this same river. Each new sample has the potential to reshape what we think we know about who lived here, when, and how the ancestry of modern Egyptian families actually connects to the world of the pharaohs. The old story gave you a single, unbroken royal line, tidy enough to fit in a museum placard. The genome gives you something larger, a civilization built at the crossing point of 3 continents. A population shaped by thousands of years of arrival, mixing, and quiet continuity. A name, still spoken on the banks of the same river today, that may carry within it the genetic memory of a history far too layered for any dynasty list to have ever captured. It is still being read, one mummy, one genome, one Nile Valley village at a time. If there's an ancient people or a hidden ancestry story you'd like uncovered next, leave it in the comments. Some of the most surprising discoveries in human history start exactly that way.